This is the start of my presentation about the introduction to sports psychology and biomechanical principles. In this presentation I'll be covering personality types, motivation and arousal, aggression and assertion, application of forces, Newton's law of motion, reaction forces, projectile in motion, momentum and impulse lever systems. This page is about personality types and is covered in sports psychology. Personality types are individual to the person and determine how people are in certain situations, for example the traits they have such as confidence. There are two types of personality type, introvert and extrovert. Introverts' main traits are shy, quiet and enjoys their own company. Introverts don't usually socialise and introduce with a small group of friends usually, and they may play individual sports in opposed to team sports. Extroverts' main traits are outgoing, talkative, sociable and loud, and they usually play for team sports such as basketball or football. Extroverts are usually louder individuals. This can help them with sports as it helps them play with confidence and communicate with teammates. Personality types relate to motivation and arousal studied later on in the PowerPoint. On this page I'll be covering motivation. Extrinsic motivation occurs when we are motivated to perform a behaviour or engage in an activity in order to earn a reward or avoid punishment. Examples of this behaviour as result in extrinsic motivation include studying because you want to get a good grade, participating in sport events because you want to win awards, competing in contests in order to win a scholarship. In each of these examples, the behaviour is motivated by a desire to gain a reward or avoid a negative outcome. Intrinsic motivation involves engaging in behaviour because it's personally rewarding, essentially performing an activity for its own sake rather than a desire for some external reward. Examples of behaviours that result in intrinsic motivation include participating in sport because you find the activity enjoyable, solving a word puzzle because you find the challenging fun and interesting, playing a game because you find it exciting. In each of these instances, a person's behaviour is motivated by an internal desire to participate in an activity for its own sake. On this page we will be covering arousal. The text below is all words relating to arousal theories which will help me when I go into more detail on the next slide. Coaction is people working together on the same task alongside each other, for example triplet and the audience effect of dash heel. Social facilitation is an improvement in performance produced by the presence of others. There are two types of social facilitation, coaction effects and the audience effect. Individuals' behaviours are influenced by the real, imagined or implied presence of others. Dominant responses increase arousal and enhances an individual's tendency to perform a dominant response. This means that whatever you are normally inclined to do, you will be even more strongly inclined to do in the presence of others. In an easy task, the dominant response is usually correct or successful, while in a more difficult task, the dominant response is often unsuccessful or incorrect. In social inhibition, social inhibition causes people to limit their feelings of behaviour in belief that others may disapprove of their behaviour. Social loafing describes a tendency of individuals to put forward less effort than they are when they are part of a group. All members of the group are combining their effort to achieve a common goal. Each member of the group can contribute less than they would if they were individually responsible. On this page I will be covering the arousal theory. Definition of the arousal theory: people are cautious and nervous around others because they know that people are unpredictable. This leaves us in a state of readiness, which is physical and mental arousal, like fight or flight response. Jacques said if a task is well practiced, a dominant response takes over and tends to be correct. If the performer is not highly aroused in front of the audience, social facilitation occurs and the arousal increases, therefore audience effect is positive. When the task is difficult and not well learned, social inhibition occurs because the audience puts us off. Jacques' research where the cockroach put into a maze and was judged whether the cockroach was good at completing the maze. They were placed in the maze where they could not see the other cockroaches, seen in this image here. That those who were good at the maze completed the second maze quicker. Those that were not good at the first maze completed it slower. This is where they had an audience and had to try and complete it to the end. Evidence of Jacques' theory, Michaels et al. The aim of this theory is to investigate the presence of the audience on the performance of the average and below pool players from a distance college in the student union. Result he found that the average pool players increased their shot accuracy percentage by 9% when they were being watched. Below average showed a decrease by 11% when they were being watched. On this page I will be continuing the arousal theory. Yerkes Dodson Law explains that Jacques' theory doesn't explain why people are good at a task performed badly in front of an audience. Yerkes Dodson explained this by saying that there is an optimum level of arousal. Too much or too little arousal has a negative effect on performance. Between comfort and anxiety is the optimum range of arousal. Either side of that, too little is bad and too much is bad. On this page I will be covering aggression and assertion in sports. Aggression, behaviour incorporating the desire to injure or harm another player. For example, Mike Tyson when he bit Evander Holyfield's ear off in a boxing match. Why might sports people become more aggressive? This is our frustration, which is backed up by Dollard and by Dollard do. Anger, not necessarily always the cause behind aggression, however it is most likely the precursor to aggression. Completion hypothesis, Murphy 2005, whenever someone is in a negative state of mind, they are more likely to become aggressive. Assertion is goal directed, with no intent to harm or injure, and the use of legitimate amount of force, and does not break the rules of the game. On this page I'll be covering the application of forces, which is a basic biomechanical principle. Force is a push or pull, and many forces act on you all of the time. The force of gravity acts on you all of the time. For example, in sport, squatting, you are squatting. When you squat, the weight of the bar is pulling you down towards the floor, which is seen in image B, which is application of force of gravity, but also when you're standing still, seen in image A, the floor is pushing you up just as hard as the force of gravity is pulling you down. This relates to the application of forces, as forces are applied in both the eccentric and concentric segment of the movement. The application of forces relates to reaction forces studied later on in this PowerPoint. On this page I will be covering Newton's law of motion in sports. Newton's law of motion form the basis for principles used in sports movement. Methods of training that depart from these laws will not make sense mechanically. Tips for efficient sport performance are built around these laws and principles. There are two basic types of motion. These come into play in the combination when applying mechanical principles to sport. Number 1. Linear motion occurs when the object or person travels in a straight line, as when sledging across a level surface. Number 2. Angular motion occurs when an object or person turns around at a centre point, axis or fulcrum and does not travel from place to place. It is common in diving and gymnastic skills when the athlete rotate, twist or spin. Newton's law of motion applied to the pull phase of a power clean, which is seen in this image here. On this page we will be covering reaction forces. A reaction force is an opposing force to an initial action. We can show the forces acting on an object using a force diagram. In a force diagram, each force is shown as a force arrow, and then the arrow shows the size of the force. The longer the arrow, the bigger the force, the direction in which the force acts. The arrow is usually labelled with the name of the force and its size in newtons. Here's an example of a reaction force. This is the table and a book. The weight of the book is going down and the reaction of the table is forcing up. This is also the same in a squat and a bench press, as the bar goes down and as you lift it back up. On this page we'll be covering projectiles in motions. Projectiles in sports involve objects in flight. These principles about the effect of force on angle, height, impact objects and athletes. A projectile is an object that has no external force other than gravity, said Brown in 2010, which backs up the following. Principles about forces that affect flight. The force pushing an object determines its direction and rotation in flight. For example, a curved ball travels slower than a straight ball due to the force of the spin due to gravity in cricket. Principles about the angle height of projections in sports. The time in flight depends upon the height it attains. For example, a springboard diver attempts to project himself high in the air. The speed takeoff has an impact on the projectile height of the jump. Training to build power fitness or combination of speed and strength will improve jumping in the air time, as shown in the pictures below. Projectiles in motion relates to momentum and impulse, studied later on in the PowerPoint. On this page we'll be covering momentum and impulse. Using impulse to increase momentum, the task in many sports skills is to cause a large change of velocity of something. In thrown events, the ball, shot, discus, thrown or frisbee has no velocity at the beginning of the throw, and the task is to give it fast velocity by the end of the throw. We want to increase the momentum. Similarly in striking events, the racket or bat, fist, club or stick has no velocity at the beginning of the swing or stroke or punch, and the task is to give the implement a fast velocity just before its impact. Our bodies may be the objects whose momentum we want to increase in jumping events and other activities. In all of these three activities, techniques used may explain in the part of by impulse momentum relationship. A large change of velocity is produced by a large average net force acting over a long time interval. Because there are limits to forces humans are capable of producing, many sport techniques involve increasing the duration of the force application. Self-experiment theories to see how the force duration affects performance. Take a ball in your throwing hand and see how far or how fast you can throw it, only using your wrist motions. It's not very far. Then use the elbow and wrist, and then again it's not very far as well. Then once again it's thrown as you would normally, and that's as further as you'd get in the other two. On this page we will be covering lever system. A lever is a rigid structure hinged at one point and to which forces are applied at two other points. The hinge is known as a fulcrum. The two forces act on the lever: the weight that opposes a movement and the force that causes a movement. Classification of levers can be remembered by 1, 2, 3 FRE. That is the classification of the lever, the numbers, and that is the position of the fulcrum, resistance and effort. Class 3 is the most common class of the lever found in the human body. Examples of strength and conditioning by Davis et al. Provides the following examples of lever systems in the body. Class 1 uses the elbow, which can be seen in this picture here, and this can be used as a seated tricep extension. Class 2, which you see in this picture, is the ankle, which is shown as calf raises. Class 3 is the knee, which can be used as a leg extension, shown in this picture here. These images here show the classifications of levers. This page contains my references and bibliography and is the end of my presentation.